Anita Yuen admitted the ugly truth. She was a premium mistress. The $500,000 she received every month from Tycoon Luo Zhaohui wasn't a gift. It was the rental fee for her body. He proved that a Miss Hong Kong crown is just a VIP ticket to the flesh market, allowing a star to sell herself at a much higher price than an ordinary woman. She was an anomaly in the Hong Kong entertainment ecosystem. While many starlets of the era were runaways escaping poverty or refugees from broken homes seeking a savior, Anita came from the side of the law. She was born into the rigid, starched collar world of the Royal Hong Kong Police Force. Her father was a police officer, and she grew up in the disciplined environment of police quarters. The air in her childhood home was thick with the scent of ironed uniforms and the unspoken expectation of order. This background did not produce a demure, submissive wallflower. It produced a fighter. In the chaotic, often triad-run world of 1990s showbiz, Anita Yuen walked with the swagger of someone who knew the rules but chose to break them. She was loud. She was abrasive. She possessed a terrifying, raw charisma that refused to be polished into the standard porcelain doll silence expected of female celebrities. They called her Lao, the sharp-tongued girl who could cut you with a look. This fire was her greatest asset, but it would also become the crack in her armor where the corruption would eventually seep in. At 19 years old, Anita entered the Miss Hong Kong pageant. The year was 1990, the peak of the pageant's cultural dominance. On the night of the finals, the Hong Kong Coliseum was packed with the city's elite. When the heavy rhinestone-encrusted cape was draped over her shoulders and the crown placed on her head, Anita Yuen wasn't just winning a contest, she was being anointed as the daughter of the city. The photographs from that night show a young woman with a radiant, almost aggressive smile. She looked less grateful than victorious. She looked like she owned the moment. While most beauty queens endure a purgatory of bad scripts and decorative roles, Anita sprinted past them, rejecting the mold of the silent flower vase. Meant to stand mutely next to Jackie Chan, she inhabited the frame, stripping away the artifice of the era with visceral intensity. By 1994, at the age of 23, she had achieved the impossible. She won the Hong Kong Film Award for Best Actress for C'est la vie, mon chéri. The industry nodded. A lucky break, they thought. But the very next year, she returned to the podium to accept the same award for He's a Woman, She's a Man. Back-to-back victories. She was untouchable. She was the Audrey Hepburn of the East, but with a distinctly Cantonese edge, street smart, cynical, and undeniably modern. But success in 1990s, Hong Kong was a dangerous drug, and Anita was overdosing on it. The speed of her rise stripped away her defenses. She was earning millions, commanding film sets, and being worshipped by a public that saw her as the embodiment of the Hong Kong dream. The discipline of the police quarters faded into a distant memory, replaced by the sycophancy of entourages and the limitless indulgence of the film industry. She began to believe her own mythology. She believed she was invincible. This hubris made her blind. She failed to see that in the VIP boxes of the award ceremonies, in the private rooms of the exclusive restaurants where she celebrated her victories, she was being watched. The eyes tracking her were not those of fans or film critics. They belonged to a predatory species of men peculiar to that time and place, the hyper-wealthy property prodigies who treated the city as their personal monopoly board. For these men, the accumulation of wealth had hit a ceiling of satisfaction. A new Rolls-Royce or another luxury penthouse no longer provided the dopamine hit they craved. They needed trophies that could breathe. They needed to possess the things the public worshipped. In the unspoken hierarchy of the Tycoon class, having a famous actress on one's arm was the ultimate status symbol, a tangible proof of dominance that transcended mere bank balances. The atmosphere of the industry facilitated this hunting. It was a world of blur and noise where moral lines were erased by the sheer velocity of money. Actresses were constantly maneuvered into dinner parties with wealthy investors, events that ostensibly were about networking, but functioned as high-end showrooms for human capital. In this environment, a young woman, no matter how talented or fierce, was under constant siege. The offers started as gifts: a diamond watch left in a dressing room, a bouquet of flowers so large it required 2 assistants to carry, a friendly offer to use a private jet for a holiday. Anita Yuen, the girl from the police dorms, stood at the precipice of this glittering abyss. She was armed with talent and a sharp tongue, but she was woefully unprepared for the sophistication of the trap being laid for her. She had conquered the box office, but she had not yet encountered the buyer. She did not yet know that her value was being calculated not in box office receipts, but in a monthly allowance that would soon become the most shameful line item in her life story. The stage was set, the lights were blinding, and somewhere in the shadows of the VIP section, a checkbook was opening. Standing at the precipice of this glittering abyss was Luo Zhaohui. If the entertainment industry was an aquarium of exotic creatures, Luo was the man tapping on the glass with a diamond ring. The gravitational pull that would eventually derail Anita Yuen's life originated far from the movie sets. Lacking the dynastic pedigree of the established families, Luo was a creature of the streets and a prodigy of the hustle. He entered the real estate market at the age of 16, a time when most boys were worrying about exams or school crushes. Luo was worrying about square footage and leverage. He possessed a supernatural instinct for the flip. In the late 80s and early 90s, Hong Kong property was not just housing. It was a high-stakes casino where the house never seemed to win. Only the players did. Luo played harder and faster than anyone else. He would spot a commercial building in the morning, secure a bridge loan by lunch, acquire the deed by the afternoon, and sell it for a 20% profit before the ink was dry. By the time he was 27, an age when Anita Yuen was winning her first Best Actress award, Luo Zhaohui was sitting atop a personal fortune estimated at 2 billion Hong Kong dollars. In the context of 1993, this sum was mythical. It was a staggering accumulation of capital that defied the laws of economic gravity. But money earned that quickly does something to the human psyche. It removes the concept of value and replaces it entirely with the concept of price. For Luo, there was no object, no property, and eventually no person that did not have a number attached to it. He moved through the city like a shark in a tuxedo, his appetite growing with every acquisition. He bought the mandatory symbols of the nouveau riche, the fleet of Rolls-Royces with custom license plates, the mansions on the peak that looked down physically and metaphorically on the rest of the population, and the Sunseeker yacht, a floating palace named Miracle, where the champagne never stopped flowing and the laws of the land seemed to dissolve in the salt air. However, for a man like Luo, material possessions had a law of diminishing returns. A car is just metal and leather. A house is just concrete and glass. Once you have 10 of them, the 11th brings no joy. He needed a new asset class, something that offered a higher yield of ego gratification. He turned his attention to the most visible, most coveted commodities in the city, the women of the silver screen. In the patriarchy of Hong Kong's elite, collecting actresses was a blood sport. It was a way for the new money to force the old money to pay attention. If you could have the woman every man in the territory dreamed of, you weren't just rich, you were powerful. You were a king. Luo Zhaohui approached this new market with cold, analytical precision. Desperate starlets seeking handouts held no appeal. He craved the untouchables. He viewed women like Anita not as companions but as blue-chip stocks, names that carried weight and faces that sold magazines. Anita Yuen was the ultimate challenge. She was the hottest stock on the board. She was young, she was undeniably talented, and she had a reputation for being difficult, fiery, and independent. She wasn't a vase waiting to be filled. She was a force of nature. To acquire Anita Yuen would be the ultimate coup. It would prove that Luo Zhaohui could tame anything. He began his campaign not with a direct offer, but with an encirclement strategy. He infiltrated her world. He became a fixture at the events where the film industry and the financial sector rubbed shoulders. The charity galas, the premiere after parties, the private dinners in the VIP rooms of the Grand Hyatt. He masked the predator within, presenting himself instead as a fan, a patron, a friend with infinite resources. He understood that a woman like Anita, who was already earning a significant income, could not be bought with a simple bribe. She had to be overwhelmed. She had to be drowned in a level of luxury that made her own success feel small. Luo weaponized his lifestyle. He created a reality distortion field around her. When he learned it was her birthday, he didn't just send a bouquet, he commissioned a floral invasion. He flooded her production set with 20 different types of exotic flowers, imported from 3 different continents, creating a garden in the middle of a concrete soundstage. It was a gesture so grand, so publicly humiliating in its generosity, that it forced everyone on set, the director, the crew, the other actors, to acknowledge his presence. It marked her. It was a way of pissing on the territory. He invited her to dinners where the wine cost more than a crew member's yearly salary. He surrounded her with people who deferred to him, who laughed too hard at his jokes, who scrambled to light his cigarettes. He showed her the view from the top of the pyramid. For a girl who had grown up in police quarters, where authority was based on rank and badge number, this was a new kind of authority, the absolute unchecked power of capital. Luo Zhaohui was charming in the way a snake charmer is charming. He was attentive. He listened to her complain about the grueling hours of filming, the idiocy of directors, the pressure of the press. He offered his yacht as a sanctuary, a place where she could escape the lenses of the paparazzi. He played the role of the benevolent protector perfectly. But beneath the charm, the calculator was always running. Luo was assessing her vulnerabilities. He saw the vanity of a 20-year-old who had achieved too much too soon. He saw the insecurity that lurked beneath the bravado. He saw that despite her awards, she was still a young woman navigating a shark tank, and she was tired. He offered her a solution to the tiredness. He offered her a life where she didn't have to fight for everything. He began to introduce the idea of support. It wasn't framed as a transaction initially. It was framed as care. Why should she work so hard? Why should she worry about the future? He was there. He could take care of everything. The grooming process was slow and methodical. He desensitized her to his wealth. A flight on a private jet became normal. A weekend in Paris became a standard Tuesday. He isolated her from the reality of her peers, her friends from the police compound, her colleagues who took the bus to work. They began to fade into the background, replaced by the sycophants of Luo's inner circle. He was rewriting her normality. He was preparing her for the closing of the deal. Luo Zhaohui knew that everyone has a price, but the currency isn't always cash. For Anita, the currency was validation. He fed her ego until it was bloated and hungry for more. He made her feel that this lavish treatment was exactly what she deserved as the queen of Hong Kong cinema. He validated her entitlement. And once she was addicted to that feeling of being the center of the universe, he prepared to name his price. He didn't view himself as corrupting her. In his warped worldview, he was offering her a promotion. He was offering her a position in his portfolio. The tragedy was that Anita, sharp as she was, didn't see the ledger. She saw a man who adored her. She saw a romance that defied the conventions of her upbringing. She didn't see the wife waiting at home, or if she did, she chose to edit her out of the script, treating her as a minor character in the grand epic of her own life. She didn't realize that to Luo Zhaohui, she was just another property he was looking to acquire before the market shifted. He was ready to make the offer that would change the trajectory of her life, an offer that would strip away the pretense of romance and lay the relationship bare as a cold, hard financial arrangement. The $500,000 was already sitting in an account, waiting to be transferred. The contract was drafted in his mind. All that was left was for the prey to walk voluntarily into the cage, believing she was stepping into a palace. The prodigy was about to close his favorite deal. The transition from courtship to contract was not a sudden, violent event. It did not happen in a shadowy back alley with a briefcase of illicit cash. In the high-altitude world of Hong Kong's elite, the purchase of a human being is conducted with the elegance of a corporate merger. It happens over shark fin soup in private dining rooms, amidst the clinking of crystal and the murmur of deferential waiters. It happens when the boundaries between a gift and a payment are deliberately blurred until the recipient can no longer tell where the romance ends and the employment begins. For Anita Yuen, the transaction was the moment the unspoken became spoken, and the sheer weight of Luo Zhaohui's financial power crushed the moral compass she had inherited from her police officer father. Then came the number 500,000 Hong Kong dollars per month. In 1991, where a university graduate earned $8,000, $500,000 was a statistical absurdity. It was not a salary. It was empire-building capital. It was an amount that defied the logic of labor. A senior police inspector, a man with decades of service and the weight of the law on his shoulders, would have to work for nearly 2 years to earn what Luo Zhaohui was offering to wire into a 20-year-old girl's account every 30 days. This was not pocket money. This was empire-building capital. With $500,000 a month in the early 90s, one could purchase a respectable apartment in Kowloon every single month. It was a sum that granted immediate, absolute financial independence. It was fuck you money. It was enough to buy silence, enough to buy loyalty, and as Luo calculated, enough to buy the exclusive rights to the time and affection of a Miss Hong Kong. When Luo placed this figure on the table, he wasn't offering to support a girlfriend. He was establishing a market rate for dignity. He was saying with brutal clarity, this is what you are worth to me, not as a person, but as an asset. The brilliance of Luo's strategy lay in how he framed the payment. He didn't present it as a salary for services rendered. That would be prostitution, and Anita Yuen, proud, headstrong, and celebrated, would have slapped him. Instead, he framed it as care. He presented the money as a shield against the indignities of the world. Why should the most beautiful woman in Hong Kong have to worry about a mortgage? Why should a two-time Best Actress winner have to negotiate her own taxi fares? He was the provider, the benevolent patriarch who was merely ensuring that his beloved lived in the comfort she deserved. He weaponized her own exhaustion against her. The film industry was a grinder. The hours were brutal, the conditions often harsh. Luo offered an anesthetic in the form of a bank transfer. And so, the grooming process reached its terminal velocity. The Bao-Yang relationship, the euphemism for being kept, began not with a signature on a document, but with a gradual surrender of autonomy. The money hit the account. The first month, it might have felt like a miracle, a lottery win. The rush of seeing those zeros on a bank statement is a potent drug, specifically designed to bypass the logical centers of the brain. For a girl who had grown up in the rigid, salary-capped world of the civil service, this was liberation. It was the key to the candy store. But money of that magnitude is never free. It comes with invisible strings that harden into chains. With the allowance came the expectations. Luo Zhaohui was a married man. This was not a secret. It was a fact of life that was conveniently airbrushed out of their private reality. By accepting the money, Anita was implicitly accepting the terms of the trade. She was the third party. She was the mistress. She was the secret garden he visited when the domestic reality of his marriage became too boring. The psychological mechanism Anita used to justify this to herself is a fascinating study in cognitive dissonance. In her later years, with the benefit of hindsight and maturity, she would call it vanity. But at 20, it felt like love. It had to be love. Because if it wasn't love, then what was she? If it wasn't a grand tragic romance where they were fighting against the world, then she was simply a highly paid employee in a rich man's harem. To protect her own ego, to preserve her self-image as a strong, independent woman, she had to believe the fairy tale Luo was spinning. She told herself that his marriage was a sham, a loveless arrangement on paper, and that she was the only one who truly understood him. She convinced herself that the money was irrelevant, a mere side effect of his power rather than the foundation of their entire connection. Luo fed this delusion. He was a master of the grand gesture. The relationship was a blur of high-octane consumption. They didn't just go to dinner. They commandeered entire restaurants. He would fly her to London for a weekend just to buy a specific handbag, treating the Concorde like a shuttle bus. He introduced her to the rarefied air of the super-rich, a world where the laws of physics and finance didn't seem to apply. In this world, desires were instantly gratified. If she looked at a piece of jewelry in a window, it was on her wrist before she could finish her sentence. This lifestyle was the grooming. It was designed to make the real world unbearable. Once you have tasted the specific insulated silence of a private jet, the noise of a commercial cabin feels like an insult. Once you have grown accustomed to the deference of staff who know your bill is being paid by a billionaire, the indifference of the general public feels like a slight. Luo was rewriting her baseline for normalcy. He was making her dependent not just on his money, but on the feeling of superiority that his money provided. The tragedy of the transaction was how it eroded the very qualities that made Anita Yuen unique. The Lao, the fierce, sharp-tongued girl who took no prisoners, was slowly being suffocated by luxury. She was becoming a kept woman, a role that required submission, availability, and a certain willful blindness. She had to ignore the phone calls he took in the other room. She had to ignore the nights he went home to his wife. She had to ignore the whispers of the crew on her film sets who saw the cars picking her up and knew exactly what was happening. The industry is a small village. Everyone knew Luo Zhaohui's reputation. They knew he was a collector, and they knew Anita had been collected. But the most insidious part of the transaction was the silence it purchased. For $500,000 a month, you don't just get companionship, you get complicity. Anita became a co-conspirator in her own exploitation. She defended him. She rationalized his behavior. When friends or family tried to warn her, to point out the stark power imbalance, she cut them off. She was the best actress after all. She could convince an audience of anything. And the most important audience member she had to convince was the girl in the mirror. She told herself she was in control. She was the one winning the awards. She was the one with the fame. He was just the lucky man who got to be with her. It was a comforting lie. In reality, the power dynamic was overwhelmingly tilted in favor of the man signing the checks. He could stop the payments tomorrow. He could replace her next week. The real estate prodigy knew that assets depreciate. He knew that novelty wears off. He was already looking at the market, scanning for the next big thing, the next fresh face to add to the portfolio. Anita, suspended in the amber of luxury, didn't feel the ground shifting. She didn't realize that the $500,000 wasn't a measure of her value. It was a measure of her price. And prices in Hong Kong fluctuate. The bubble was expanding, stretching the skin of the city until it was translucent, and everyone, from the tycoons to the taxi drivers, was too drunk on greed to hear the sound of the fabric tearing. The crash was coming. And when the crash came, the first things to be liquidated would be the luxuries, the yachts, the cars, and the mistresses. The transaction was complete. The money had changed hands. The soul had been collateralized. Anita Yuen was now a part of Luo Zhaohui's balance sheet. And like any other asset in a volatile market, she was about to find out what happens when a billionaire goes bust. The gilded cage was locked, the key was in Luo's pocket, and the storm clouds of 1997 were gathering on the horizon, ready to blow the door wide open and expose everything inside to the unforgiving light of public scrutiny. The bill was coming due. If the transaction in the gilded cage was a quiet, private moral erosion, the destruction of that cage was a deafening public spectacle. In the narrative of Hong Kong, there is a distinct before and after, marked by the year 1997. It was the year the British flag came down, the Chinese flag went up, and the Asian financial crisis tore through the region like a tsunami, wiping out decades of accumulated wealth in a matter of weeks. The property bubble, that shimmering iridescent sphere upon which Luo Zhaohui had built his entire identity, did not just deflate, it exploded with the force of a bomb. The real estate prodigy, the man who believed he could outsmart the market forever, was caught with his leverage exposed. Luo had bought aggressively at the very peak, acquiring luxury properties and commercial buildings with borrowed money, convinced that the trajectory was infinite. When the Thai baht collapsed, triggering a contagion that decimated the Hang Seng Index, the value of his portfolio evaporated overnight. The banks, once his eager partners, turned into executioners. They called in the loans, the collateral, the mansions, the stocks, the businesses, was worthless against the mountain of debt he had accrued. By late 2000, Luo Zhaohui was not just bankrupt, he was obliterated. The man who had once casually signed checks for $500,000 to keep a mistress was now hiding from debt collectors. The psychological toll of this descent cannot be overstated. For a narcissist like Luo, wealth was not just a tool, it was his oxygen. Without it, he began to suffocate. The shame was absolute. He retreated to his yacht, the Miracle, the last vestige of his empire, docked in the typhoon shelter of Causeway Bay. But the Miracle had run out. In December 2000, in a final act of despair, he sealed the cabin and burned charcoal, attempting to asphyxiate himself with carbon monoxide. He survived, but the man who was pulled from that cabin was not the same Luo Zhaohui who had charmed Anita Yuen. The lack of oxygen, combined with the trauma of his financial ruin, seemed to fracture his psyche. He emerged from the hospital not with humility, but with a virulent, chaotic rage. He was physically diminished, reportedly suffering from various ailments, but mentally, he had transformed into something dangerous. He had nothing left to lose, and in the calculus of the desperate, that meant everything was for sale. Luo looked around the wreckage of his life and realized he still possessed one asset class that the banks couldn't seize: his memories. He held the secrets of the Hong Kong elite. He knew who slept with whom, who took bribes, and who had a price tag. In a society obsessed with face, he held the nuclear codes, and he needed cash. Fast. The tabloids, particularly the notorious East Week and Next magazine, were the vultures circling the carcass of his reputation. They smelled blood. They approached the fallen tycoon, or perhaps he approached them. The exact genesis is murky, but the result was clear. Luo Zhaohui began to talk. He didn't just whisper, he screamed. He treated his past relationships not as romances, but as a catalog of conquests, using the crude Cantonese slang of stamp collecting to describe his sexual history with famous actresses. It was in this toxic atmosphere of 2002 that the Anita Yuen file was open to the public. Anita, by this time, had successfully navigated away from the turbulence of her early 20s. She was in a stable, loving relationship with Julian Chung Chi Lam, a fellow actor known for his gentlemanly demeanor and boyish charm. They were the industry's golden couple, projecting an image of wholesome domesticity that was the antithesis of the tycoon culture. Anita was rebuilding her legacy, letting her acting speak for itself, burying the indiscretions of her youth under a layer of respectability. Luo Zhaohui ripped that layer away. In a series of explosive interviews, accompanied by grainy photos and the salacious promise of a sex diary, Luo detailed his relationship with the former Miss Hong Kong. He didn't speak of love. He spoke of economics. He revealed the numbers. He told the reporters, and by extension the entire population of Hong Kong, exactly how much it cost to maintain Anita Yuen. $500,000 a month. The figure was splashed across the front pages of the entertainment dailies. It was printed in bold black type, a scarlet letter branded onto Anita's reputation. The revelation was devastating because it was specific. Rumors are easy to dismiss. A ledger entry is harder to ignore. The public, which had idolized Anita as a symbol of talent and beauty, was forced to confront the transactional nature of her past. The narrative shifted instantly. She was no longer just the best actress. She was the $500,000 girl. The humiliation was designed to be total. Luo, in his madness, seemed to relish the destruction he was causing. He described the grooming process, the gifts, the secret meetups, painting a picture of Anita not as a victim, but as a willing participant in her own commodification. He stripped her of her agency and reduced her to a line item in his bankruptcy proceedings. But the prodigy wasn't finished. The mere publication of the story wasn't enough to satisfy his need for vengeance against a world that had moved on while he was left behind. He wanted to inflict pain directly on the source of Anita's current happiness, Julian Chung. The story of the phone call has become a grim legend in Hong Kong showbiz lore, a moment of such profound malice that it defines the character of Luo in his final years. According to widespread reports and later confirmations by insiders, Luo Zhaohui, in a fit of drug-induced or alcohol-fueled bravado, picked up the phone and dialed Julian Chung. Julian, the supportive boyfriend and arguably the most decent man in the industry, answered the phone expecting a casting agent or a friend. Instead, he hears the voice of the man who owned his partner before him. Luo didn't offer an apology. He didn't offer a warning. He reportedly delivered a taunt that was meant to emasculate Julian and destroy his relationship with Anita in one sentence. "I used to keep your wife for $500,000. It was a sentence designed to do maximum damage. It was a spear thrown right at the heart of Julian's masculinity. In the deeply traditional patriarchal society of Hong Kong, a man's face is tied to the purity of his partner. Luo was telling Julian, "You are driving a used car. You are loving a woman I rented." He was trying to plant a seed of disgust in Julian's mind, hoping it would grow into resentment and eventually destroy the couple's bond. The cruelty of this act is breathtaking. It served no financial purpose. It didn't get Luo his money back. It didn't restore his empire. It was pure, unadulterated sadism. It was the lash of a dying beast. The media frenzy that followed was suffocating. Paparazzi camped outside Anita and Julian's home, their lenses long enough to see through the curtains. Every time the couple stepped out, they were bombarded with questions about the price tag. Is it true? Did you take the money? Julian, how do you feel knowing your girlfriend was a mistress? For Anita, this was the dark night of the soul. The shame was physical. She had to walk onto film sets knowing that every grip, every lighting technician, every extra had read the morning papers. She had to look into the eyes of her colleagues and see the calculation happening behind them. She saw her hard-won awards, her critical acclaim, her carefully reconstructed life, all being weighed against that monthly sum. The scandal threatened to be a career ender. In the conservative culture of Asian entertainment, actresses had been blacklisted for far less. The label of gold digger or kept woman is usually a terminal diagnosis. Advertisers drop contracts. Directors look for cleaner faces. The audience, feeling betrayed, turns the channel. Anita Yuen stood in the center of this storm, stripped naked by the man she once thought was her protector. The gilded cage was gone, replaced by a pillory in the town square. She was alone, exposed, and seemingly defenseless against the onslaught of a man who had turned his own life into a weapon and was determined to take everyone down with him. The visual paradox was complete, the radiant beauty queen on the magazine covers versus the sordid, quantified mistress in the tabloids. The crash of 1997 had finally claimed its last victim. The expected script for a scandal of this magnitude in the conservative, face-obsessed culture of Hong Kong is written in invisible ink. But everyone knows the lines. The female protagonist, branded with the scarlet letter of a kept woman, is supposed to retreat. She is expected to issue a sterile, lawyer-approved denial that insults the public's intelligence, or worse, vanish into a forced retirement, marrying a minor businessman and living out her days in the quiet shame of the suburbs. The industry, a machine fueled by the dual engines of idolatry and moral judgment, usually grinds these women into dust. The $500,000 headline should have been the epitaph for Anita Yuen's career. It was the kind of stain that does not wash out with PR campaigns or charity appearances. It was structural damage to her character. But Anita Yuen has never followed the script. In the deafening silence that followed Luo Zhaohui's scorched earth revelations, while the paparazzi were still sharpening their lenses on the sidewalk outside her home, Anita made a calculation. It was a gamble, as high stakes as any real estate deal Luo had ever brokered. She realized that the only way to survive the truth was to own it. The public could forgive a sinner. They would never forgive a liar. In a move that stunned the crisis management experts of the time, she chose not to sue, not to hide, and not to deny. She chose radical, uncomfortably bright transparency. The venue for this high-wire act was Be My Guest, the premier talk show hosted by Stephen Chan. Chan was not a typical entertainment reporter. He was the general manager of TVB, an intellectual inquisitor who treated celebrity interviews like psychological autopsies. The set was stripped back, intimate, designed to look like a living room where secrets were exchanged over tea. When Anita walked onto that stage in 2007, years after the initial scandal but with the wounds still fresh in the public consciousness, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The audience wasn't tuning in for film promotion, they were tuning in for the execution. Stephen Chan, with his characteristic soft-spoken lethality, steered the conversation toward the elephant in the room. He didn't ask about the money directly. He asked about the past. He asked about the rumors. Anita didn't flinch. She didn't look at her PR handler. She looked directly into the camera lens, breaking the fourth wall and addressing the millions of judges sitting in their living rooms across the territory. At that time, I was young, she began. The voice was steady, stripped of the bravado of M. Lao. It was the voice of a woman looking back at a girl she barely recognized. I thought it was love. He gave me everything. He satisfied the vanity of a 20-year-old girl. She used the word vanity, hu vinh, in Cantonese. It is a loaded term. It suggests a hollowness, a hunger for surface-level validation. By using it, she was diagnosing herself. She continued dissecting the anatomy of the grooming process without exonerating herself from the moral failure. He would fly me out for dinner. He would buy me flowers. That kind of pampering, that overwhelming attention, it makes you forget things. It made me forget that he had a wife. I was blinded by the glory of it all. This confession was a masterclass in emotional disarmament. She didn't claim she was a victim of coercion. She didn't claim she was poor and needed the money to feed a sick relative. She admitted to the one sin that is universally relatable: human greed. She admitted that she liked the private jets. She admitted that she liked the feeling of being the chosen one. By framing it as vanity rather than prostitution, she shifted the narrative from a financial transaction to a moral error of youth. She stripped the 500,000 Hong Kong dollars figure of its power by acknowledging the desire that fueled it. I hurt his wife, she added, a critical admission that acknowledged the collateral damage of her selfishness. I was the third party. I was wrong. The effect of this interview was seismic. In a culture where saving face usually involves aggressive denial, Anita's willingness to lose face publicly actually restored it. She became human again. She wasn't the untouchable ice queen or the greedy mistress. She was a flawed person who had been seduced by a lifestyle designed to seduce, and who had woken up with a hangover that lasted a decade. However, the redemption of Anita Yuen required more than just her own confession. It required a second act, performed by the man standing next to her. Julian Chung, known affectionately as Chilam, was the variable that Luo Zhaohui had failed to account for. In the traditional patriarchal calculus of Chinese society, a man's honor is inextricably linked to the sexual purity of his partner. The concept of the green hat, the symbol of a cuckold or a man whose wife has been unfaithful, is a profound source of shame. Luo's phone call, his taunt about keeping Anita, was a direct attempt to force this green hat onto Julian's head. He was betting that Julian's male pride would be too fragile to withstand the public knowledge that another man had owned his woman first. Julian Chung was facing a crisis of masculinity. The press was baiting him daily. Every microphone thrust in his face was a challenge. Are you man enough to handle this? Or are you a fool for staying with damaged goods? Julian's response was not to lash out at the press, nor to distance himself from Anita. He didn't issue a statement through a lawyer. He simply stood by her side, physically and emotionally. When finally cornered for a comment on the scandal that had dominated the headlines for months, he delivered a sentence that dissolved the toxicity of the situation with the precision of a laser. "My only regret," Julian said, his voice calm and devoid of the defensive anger that usually accompanies such scandals, "is that I didn't meet her sooner. If I had met her sooner, I could have protected her." The architecture of that sentence was profound. It completely reframes the narrative. It rejects the premise that Anita was soiled or used. Instead, it positions her as someone who was vulnerable, someone who needed protection from predators like Luo, and it positions Julian not as the victim of her past, but as the guardian of her future. He didn't forgive her because that would imply she needed his permission to exist. He understood her. He acknowledged that the ecosystem of 1990s Hong Kong was a dangerous place for a 19-year-old girl, and he took on the burden of her history as a shared weight. This was a rejection of the green hat stigma. It was a definition of love that transcended the transactional nature of the city they lived in. It paralyzed the tabloids. How do you mock a man for loving his wife? How do you shame a couple when the victim refuses to be shamed? Julian's reaction turned the weapon back on Luo Zhaohui. It made the billionaire look small, petty, and vindictive, while making Julian look like a titan of emotional intelligence. They married in secret in 2001 in San Francisco, far away from the prying eyes of the Hong Kong press. There was no grand banquet, no invite list of tycoons, no diamond-studded spectacle. It was a deliberate choice. Their relationship was no longer for public consumption. It was private. It was real. While Anita and Julian were building a fortress of stability, the architect of their misery was unraveling in a spectacular, tragic fashion. The postscript of Luo Zhaohui's life serves as the grim counter-narrative to Anita's redemption. After his bankruptcy and the failed suicide attempt, Luo became a ghost haunting the fringes of the Pearl River Delta. He drifted between Hong Kong, Macau, and mainland China, trying to reignite the spark of his prodigy days. But the magic was gone. The market had changed, and he was a relic of a bygone era of cowboy capitalism. He was arrested for drug possession in Macau. He was photographed looking gaunt, disheveled, a shadow of the man who once commanded the VIP rooms of the Grand Hyatt. The sex diary revelations, which were supposed to be his golden parachute, turned out to be his final act of self-immolation. By selling out his former lovers, he ensured that no one in the elite would ever trust him again. He was radioactive. The doors that had once opened automatically were now bolted shut. He spent his final years in Dongguan, a city known for its manufacturing and its vice, living on the margins, reportedly relying on handouts from old friends who pitied him more than they respected him. On January 24th, 2011, Luo Zhaohui died of a sudden heart attack in a law firm in Dongguan. He was 47 years old. The man who had once been worth $2 billion, who had owned the most expensive real estate in the world, died with almost nothing to his name. His death was a quiet footnote in the newspapers that had once screamed his name in headlines. There was no state funeral. There was no outpouring of grief from the actresses he had collected. There was just the silence of a ledger finally balancing out to zero. The contrast between his end and Anita's trajectory is the ultimate verdict of this story. Anita Yuen is now in her 50s. She remains one of the most beloved figures in Chinese cinema. She acts when she wants to. She appears on variety shows with Julian, where their bickering, affectionate dynamic is celebrated as the ideal marriage. They have a son. They have a life that is palpably, undeniably solid. The 500,000 Hong Kong dollar scandal is still there, in the archives of the internet, but it has lost its venom. It is viewed now not as a defining crime, but as a scar, proof that she survived a battle. What is the legacy of this dark history? It is a brutal lesson in the economics of dignity. In the Hong Kong of the 1990s, beauty was treated as a depreciating asset. It was something to be leased, used, and discarded before the expiry date. Men like Luo Zhaohui believed that because they could buy the time of a woman, they could own her soul. They believed that the price tag was the only thing that mattered. Anita Yuen proved them wrong. She proved that while you can rent a person's presence, you cannot buy their essence. She showed that a woman's worth is not determined by the mistakes of her youth, but by the courage of her maturity. She demonstrated that the true value in a relationship is not the monthly allowance, but the willingness to stand in the fire together. The paradox resolves itself in a final, quiet contrast. Luo Zhaohui lies forgotten, his ledger balanced to zero. Meanwhile, Anita Yuen walks the streets of Hong Kong, hand in hand with her husband, passing the very luxury hotels that once served as her gilded cage. The bird didn't just fly away. She learned to hunt the hunters. The transaction is closed. The debt is paid. And in the end, the only thing that retained its value was the truth.